I'm pleased to welcome you into a Wyeth Conversations at home, as it were, with Professor John Wilmerding by my side here in New York City, an offsite Wyeth Conversations here, and a chance to get a bit of insight into a really fascinating professional career that has intersected with that of Andrew and Betsy Wyeth on many occasions. So lots of stories to share. I am a de facto moderator here with my colleague Mary Cronin behind the scenes back at the Brandywine, who will be able to help with the any technical questions that may come up here. We invite you to use the chat function at the bottom of your webinar screen to share where you're tuning in from or thoughts on what you're hearing. And then the Q&A function would be especially for any burning questions you're hoping to have answered. We have a lot to cover, but we're hoping to get to at least a couple of questions at the end. Glad to follow up later. Wyeth Study Center at brandywine.org if there's a question you didn't get answered. Some other little general points here. This is a note that the event is being recorded. So we'll be able to share with others who aren't able to tune in live what we've learned here tonight from Professor Wilmerding. There is closed captioning available if you want to use that function. And I also want to let you know about some upcoming events. There will be two virtual talks with Victoria Wyeth, the artist's granddaughter, on Jamie Wyeth's recent work on April 24 and 25. Our current exhibition, Andrew Wyeth Home Places, continues through July 16th, and the virtual tour of that exhibition is also on the Brandywine YouTube channel. Without further ado, let's jump in, and I'll share my screen. And we have some images here that will kind of structure our conversation. We're allowing room for spontaneity, and we've talked about some topics that might be of interest, but I have no idea what our honored guest might share with us today. John Wilmerding is Christopher Binyon Sarofim Professor of American Art Emeritus at Princeton University. Among many other affiliations and institutions he's served, he's been curator, deputy director, and chairman of the board of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. He served on the board of the Guggenheim, as well as a topic we'll get to, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, for many years, as well as another topic I learned about just moments ago, the committee, I want to get the name right, the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. Yep. Committee for the Preservation of the White House, not to be confused with the White House Historical Association. The Committee for the Preservation of the White House is a presidential appointment, and there's Wyeth to talk about in that area as well. So there's a lot to cover here. This has been a fascinating career between the academy and museums. So many interesting stories, multiple instances where he's been there at the founding of a great American art museum that has Andrew Wyeth at its core. So I've just said a lot there. Welcome, Professor Wilmerding, and thank you so much for allowing us into your home.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody, a lot of friends and colleagues out there. Delighted to do this.
Yes, indeed. We've got a whole range of attendees. I was poring over the list of registrations, and we've got Wyeth fans far and wide, and also a lot of scholars and curators of American art who are as eager as I am to hear what John has to say. I thought I might start just with a little illustration of some of the academic institutions that have been a part of this man's life. We've got good old St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, top left corner, Harvard, where he did undergraduate through PhD, Dartmouth College, lower left, where he taught for 11 years, I think it was. This 11-year interval recurs, and Princeton University, lower right, where he was department chair and helped to build a great department and a great program specifically for art of the United States that continues under my honored colleague Rachel DeLuz. So lots of wonderful stories there on the academic side. He has navigated between teaching and shaping young minds and serving at the front lines of the field in that way, as well as in museums we'll hear about later. And the scholarship abounds through dozens, literally, of books. And this is just a little cursory overview, a personal selection of some that I've found useful. Some that he was sole author of, others that he contributed essays to. You'll see in the latter category, Andrew Wyeth, Memory and Magic at lower left, had to include that. At top right, one from my prior role at Olana, another place where we intersected, another kind of single artist legacy collection. So a man of many interests, and you may get a sense of that from what you're already seeing in his home over our shoulder. What are we looking at behind us there, John?
This is a late cast of a brushstroke by Roy Lichtenstein. And I got interested in this in the last 20 years, having collected 19th century, switched gears, gave that collection to Washington, and then turned to what I call small scale pop. And that's just one example.
And you'll have to take our word for it. There's a lot more as I look around the room around me. If you thought that this guy was all about 19th century American and the Wyeth world, there's a lot more here. So
I don't have to say a thing. You go, keep going.
I obviously feel it's a great privilege to get to sit by your side and hear some of your stories. So let's get into some of those stories. Quite enough from me. We thought this might be a logical place to begin, which is what was your path to the arts in general and to art of the United States in particular?
Well, it came on slowly, and I guess I have to say inevitably, in the sense that I realized that in growing up, that I had come from a collecting family. Louisine Havemeyer, H.O. Havemeyer, were my great-grandparents, the parents of the woman you see here on the left, Electra Havemeyer Webb, their daughter, who founded the Shelburne Museum, was actually putting the museum together during my preteen and teen years. So I had this awareness of an extraordinary thing going on in Vermont, where we used to have family visits, but she was actually creating a museum. I knew she was passionate about Americana, et cetera. Now, in those days, I think probably except for the Addison Gallery at Andover, no secondary education, either high school or boarding school, taught art history. It just simply didn't exist at that level. There might have been some art appreciation courses, but it was not a thing. So the irony is I grew up sort of vaguely aware of this history, but nobody interpreting it or really telling me how important it was. And it may have been that my mother had overreacted. She'd been immersed in it herself growing up and simply didn't want to impose it on me and my siblings. So nobody really bothered to say anything. And we'd go into Park Avenue, where my grandparents had an apartment, for Christmas or other holidays. And there on the walls were her share of the Havemeyer collection that had not gone to the Met, Rembrandt's, Degas, one of the great Manets in the world, or Blue Venice. And in the dining room, you could never forget it, 3 or 4 winter scenes by Monet. But in that sense, at that age, for me, this was all decoration. I realized later that I'd never been taken by my parents or anybody in the family into the Metropolitan Museum until I was in college. And so while I was well educated at boarding school, particularly in American literature and writing, and I think that's where my passion was first laid out for teaching, for wanting to write, but I had no idea about the visual arts of the visual world, except for what was going on in Vermont. And many in the family, my grandfather included, thought my grandmother Electra Webb was kind of crazy, spending all this money bringing buildings from all over the place, buying up thousands of objects, spending all her time in a convertible driving around New England, plucking weather vanes off of old barns and so forth. She seems kind of nuts. And then, I don't know when I was in school by then, away at boarding school or not, but one of the first things she built on the museum grounds was to bring in an old covered bridge, quintessential Vermont. Well, of course, she just laid it across the ground. It was where the museum entrance was in its first years. But she realized, of course, that to make a bridge work, it needs to go over something. So what does she do? She digs out a big pond underneath the bridge. But even more dramatic, and you see it in this image here, was, and I know I was away at school, so this would be somewhere in my very young teens, in the 50s. She decided the SS Ticonderoga, which was the last sidewheel steamer in Vermont on Lake Champlain, and we used to visit it regularly over holidays. There were several family members, including my sister, my mother, my grandfather, and at least one first cousin, all of whom had early July birthdays. So the excuse was to gather in Vermont on usually the July 4th weekend. And everybody would trundle up to Burlington to get to the pier. And we'd get on the Ticonderoga. And my grandmother orchestrated this tour around. We just toot around the lake for the afternoon.
So you were actually on the famous Shelburne steamship afloat.
And it was film taking of us, me and my cousins running around the deck.
That's great.
Having fun while the elders started sipping their martinis.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up with birthday cakes, and we'd come in, after dinner. So that was a memorable experience. Well, the tide had run its usefulness. Captain York, who was a good friend of my grandmother's, was going to retire. And the boat, nobody knew what to do with. It was going to be designated for demolition. And she thought that was a huge mistake of losing an important aspect of early Vermont history, let alone American history. And she announces to the family, to my grandfather, that she wants to move it to the museum grounds, which by this point in the late 40s had 2 or 3 dozen buildings already filled with stuff. I mean stuff from farm tools to carriages to circus figures, etc.
As well as incredible paintings and so much more. And we should say, go visit the Shelburne Museum. Yeah.
And she thought, well, Shelburne Harbor is, I think, something like 3 miles away. And it was a major event. It's very interesting that at the time, I remember hearing this, she couldn't find an American contractor to undertake the work to bring the tie. I don't know how many tons it is, but it obviously meant laying railroad tracks, which is what you see here, and having it dragged over the ground from Shelburne Harbor through roads and fields. And I don't know if there was any great elevation, but it was a very slow slog scheduled for the depths of winter when the ground would be frozen. And she couldn't find an American contractor, I think, for liability reasons. Nobody would tackle it. She found a French engineering company who did agree, took on the work, and there are old photographs of it being hauled across the Vermont fields along about sometime in March. And it was halfway there. It could only move, I don't know how many feet a day. And it was halfway there, and the damn thing started to sink because there was an early defrost, and there was nothing that could be done. So they watched in horror for a day or two as the tracks and the tie began to sink into the mud. Mercifully, after I think 3 days, the ground refroze and the journey was complete.
Incredible.
But it was national news. But it was a case where my grandfather Watson said to her, "Electra, I think you're crazy, but you have the money. If you want to do it, it's yours to do." And she was determined. And I think that was a very important formative aspect of my career, in the sense that I knew I was in the presence of somebody who had vision, passion. She loved to collect, incredible determination. She was a very strong figure, really major matriarchal figure, who almost destroyed her own children, but was, at least to the grandchildren and to me, wonderfully warm-hearted. So that experience of watching a museum come into being while I am in school, and then I get to Harvard College, where I stumble into the art survey, for all the wrong reasons. It's where you met the Radcliffe girls, I was told, or it's where you got looked over by the seniors for the clubs. Don't take, nobody mentioned the material. I thought, well, this is kind of strange to go into the basement of the fog, the lights get turned off. It was like going to the movies. And slides come, in those days, it was just the most awful old glass plate, black and white slides. But what happened to me in that course, my freshman year, was the scales lifting, because there I sat initially, of course, hearing about Greek and Roman temples, Egyptian temples, a prehistory. And then as the term unfolded, we got into the Middle Ages and then eventually the Renaissance. I realized very quickly, somewhat sank in, that images have meaning, real power, and that if they're articulated well, you can learn about whole civilizations. You can learn about time periods, what we call style. What's the difference between the 18th century and the 19th century or the 16th century? So this whole world opened up of insight into foreign culture, into the history of time itself, and into works of art that had incredible layers of meaning that as you came back to those works, either visiting them in the galleries or the museums in Boston, or coming back later, that each time, first thing I learned was you went back and re-looked at an important work, there was always more to learn. There was always, and it's certainly been true of my career, the longer I have worked on Fitzhenry Lane or other artists, even Andrew Wyeth, the more you realize the layerings of depths, and that's the great job and fun of the artist. So in that sense, the germ of my career was laid in that early period with my grandmother's tutelage. Now, she also introduced me to her great friend Maxim Karalik, the Boston collector. And interestingly, the last collection before she died in 1961, I had just finished my undergraduate degree, and for my senior thesis, because of my grandmother and because of others we'll talk about, I found the work of Lane in Boston and in Gloucester, where he was born. And I realized that as I did my work, I could put together an entire biography, an entire artist's life. A graduate student can't do that. An undergrad can't do that today. But by being exposed to all of this, I was able to write a full undergraduate senior honors thesis on Lane, which proved to be, a few years later, my first little published book. Extraordinary. And Karalik had given, of course, as we know, to Boston, 3 great collections of American art that come very close to rivaling Philadelphia, certainly New York and Boston. New York and Washington. And the primary of those 3 collections, one was drawings, one was folk art and furniture, but the major one was American paintings. And here was a foreigner whom I met through my grandmother, who he was a kind of de Tocqueville of modern times. He saw things in American culture that we ourselves didn't look at. And American art, as we know, wasn't taught as a discipline for years. Fortunately, I was able to help, in a way, establish the field, but nothing existed. So the discovery of my grandmother turned to Karalik to acquire a number of paintings that he had not given to Boston, that he still had in his Boston townhouse and down in his house in Newport, which was still filled with lanes and heaths, Bierstadts, and Hudson River painting, and formed the basis of Shelburne's last collection before she died. She realized that her life had been spent with decorative arts and furniture, but she also knew instinctively, even though she didn't know the material, that quote, fine art and high art had to be represented at Shelburne. And the wonderful thing in retrospect is that she turned to me for partial advice. And we corresponded about the lanes that Carol ended up selling her, I think, half a dozen wonderful lanes, half a dozen heaths that are the core of the Shelburne collection. So in many ways, it was introduction socially to a generation of collectors who were creating these great collections, both for civic museums, but also in the post-war years, these outdoor museums. My grandmother was a friend of Harry DuPont's. She certainly knew John Rockefeller, reconstituting Williamsburg, Stubby Flint at Old Deerfield, Greenfield Village in Michigan. There were this whole series of quote outdoor museums that appealed to my grandmother, and many of them were trying to articulate the power of creating these for an American public during the Cold War. But it was also, I now realize, a kind of precursor to not so much Disneyland, but to the idea of a museum, in this case, an outdoor museum, as both something to educate, but also something to enjoy, to play in. And my grandmother firmly thought that was important. So for me, that 2 or 3 year period where I could talk to her about she realized that I was, in a sense, going to pick up the torch and carry on. So it really did shape, certainly, my interest in going into the American field. Harvard didn't have an Americanist, and yet it produced a great generation of American scholars, Barbara Novak and Jules Brown, Bill Homer, Bill Gertz. I mean, an important cadre of my colleagues who got going in the field. And so as I turned from art history generally and increasingly focused in my interest on American, all of this going on set the background.
So what I hear in that is a really unique foundation for a remarkable career, and already major contributions being made in the case of that artist Fitzhenry Lane. There's a reason why we've said so much about the Shelburne Museum already. This will come up more later.
Well, there's the great one of Andy Wyeth's greatest works, if not the greatest work. It was actually a Karalik picture. Karalik had bought it from the Wyeths. Jamie remembers it. Before it had been mounted, I think it was on top of a billiard table, and before it was framed and sold as a work of art. Anyway, Karalik acquired it. The sad thing was he also acquired the drawings for it. And when my grandmother bought the painting from Karalik.
And we should clarify, this is Soaring 1940. I saw in our notes maybe the largest panel Andrew Wyeth ever made, 87 inches wide.
A great work. In so many ways that we could spend all night just talking about that. But she decided not only to collect 19th century American painting, genre painting, so to speak, imagery of American life would be obvious for a place like Shelburne. But she also ventured into the modern, and it was Karalik who helped, of course, with the Wyeth. But she also turned to Edith Halpern in New York for a great, probably Peto's greatest still life is in Shelburne. And she bought some modern sculpture. I think had she lived, she would have acquired more as she became familiar, and she was a great sort of self-learner, would have gone on in this era. But the acquisition of the Wyeth was partly, of course, it's a great realist work, and therefore updates a very strong American tradition in American art history into the present. I don't know, I didn't have a chance to talk to her about acquiring it, but I could sense that those would have been aspects that greatly appeal to her.
Makes sense. So we have there an early encounter with the work of Andrew Wyeth, who will be a through line for our conversation today. And I'm conscious of time, so
Yeah,
I do want to show some more images and some more chapters. I understand from our pre-conversation that these two institutions were important to finding your way to the work of Wyeth and to the service of the Wyeth Foundation in particular. So could you say more about that? What are we looking at here?
Well, on the left is the Cape Ann, now the Cape Ann Museum. It had a wonderfully antiquated title when I first encountered it, was the Cape Ann Scientific, Literary, and Historical Association, which, and these things dotted American cities, particularly in the older cities. And Gloucester is where Lane was born. And as I got going on my Lane research, I've forgotten who introduced me or told me about Gloucester. I mean, I knew about the Boston collection. I knew about what my grandmother was acquiring. But when somebody said, all of Lane's drawings are out at Cape Ann, like 100 of them. There are a few loose ones around, but the body of the work is there. Plus about, I'd say, 30 Lane paintings, almost entirely Massachusetts and New England pictures. Very few Maine paintings, which came later in his career. But I don't know who introduced me, but told me I ought to look up somebody named Hyde Cox, who was, it turned out, a retired, I believe, English teacher from Exeter, who had settled nearby.
You're probably getting sirens in the background. We are in New York City.
In the middle of, well, here we have two images of city life.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, Hyde Cox had retired to a house in Manchester nearby and become involved in, as I guess as president of a sort of very sleepy board, but nonetheless managed the Cape Ann Museum, now museum. And he in turn introduced me to the nominal curator of the collection, an elderly gentleman named Alfred Mansfield Brooks, who at the time I met him was in his high 80s. His family knew George Washington. I mean, this is typical New England. You meet these people, and either through genealogy or direct connection, you're not far removed.
Sure.
And I went out, and Brooks showed me around. It was then just the one building on the left, an old, sea mariner's mansion built in Gloucester in its heyday in the federal period, and collects all manner of local artists. And he showed me around. It was all all close to covered with dust. It was, nobody ever went in. So what happened was Brooks and Cox said, "Here's a key. Come out from Cambridge whenever you want to work." And so I did. It was, again, I had no idea how lucky I was to have stumbled on it. But it also turned out that Hyde Cox was a great friend of Andy and Betsy Wyeth. What I don't remember is whether it was Cox who introduced me first to the Wyeths or another Harvard connection, a man named Philip Hofer, who was, again, elderly, the longtime curator of rare books at Houghton Library at Harvard, a major graphic arts collector himself, and also had a house in Maine in the summer. And he also was a great friend of the Wyeths. Between the two of them, somewhere along the line, we met. The reason we're looking at the Farnsworth Museum in Rockland is that Cox knew the collectors there and the collection. And in those early days, the Farnsworth, again, was a kind of sleepy museum before its modern renovation, and about to undertake another new major expansion. It's one of the great success stories in Maine. In any case, it was run technically by a single trustee, I believe in the Boston, I forgot which bank, safety, but it doesn't matter which bank it was, but an old Boston bank had one elderly, it could have been a Lowell or a Cabot, just assigned to be the trustee, I say singular trustee, of the Farnsworth Museum. And the bank, for whatever legal reasons, decided to have an annual reception dinner for the collections, you know, the kind of thing that's now standard in museums, once a year in the summer months, kind of social gathering. And Cox always made a point of going down east to Rockland. And one year said to me early on, if he'd gotten to know my work, because I not only completed 4 years as undergraduate at Harvard, I stayed on to do my PhD another 5 years. So I was in Cambridge for 9 years. And on several summers, I joined Cox and we'd go to Rockland for the annual, quote, annual meeting of the Farnsworth trustee. I mean, it was a big grand occasion. And the Wyeths frequently came to that because, of course, they had Cushing was not that far away. So both those institutions also fed into sort of the grounding of my career and my first sort of serious, thorough research, and what turned out to be my first books. Now, this I should comment here. This is a good segue into the creation of the Wyeth, then the Wyeth Endowment, because we're still in the mid-60s.
Oops, where's my slide? There it is. No, darn it. I lost my slide for the Wyeth Foundation, but please continue. It's not essential.
In any case, the Wyeths had decided they would create, as many artists were beginning to do in that period, create little foundations where they could put their art or money.
Right.
Some to become big foundations and do great things, others to be the foundation of collections that then became museums. Oh, you know, we know all kinds of models from George O'Keeffe to Robert Rauschenberg to Lichtenstein. In any case, Annie and Betsy decided they would create the Wyeth Endowment for American Art. And the idea initially, it's very interesting, the idea initially was that Andy would give periodically or annually works of art to the endowment, which could be sold or kept for a future museum. It would be the discretion of what the endowment wanted to do with them. But that at least some of the works could be liquidated to create capital for doing good. And so this was established, and he gave, is it a tempera or watercolor? Brown Swiss was the first major work he gave the endowment. Well, that was to be confounded a year or two. No, sir. And I don't remember the exact founding date, but we're talking either 65 or 1960. It was the second half of the 60s. Congress decides to pass a law about taxable giving and tax rebate. Partly because the system had been badly abused by collectors and dealers who were, in a way, getting rid of cheap prints and over-exaggerated deductions. And they wanted to crack down, particularly on artists, get what they thought was getting away with murder. And so they put in this incredible law that holds, never been broken since, one of the great tragedies, that an artist in the new system may not give a work of his own, his or her own work, for full market value. An artist may only get a tax deduction for the cost of paint and canvas. And what it did was, for about a period of a year and a half, as this was about to be put in place, created a flurry of gifts to, the Whitney doubled its collection in that year before the law went into place. because they more relied on, contemporary artists. And so all of a sudden, here was this little endowment, and we'd already begun to meet, I think, a couple of times a year to make small grants, but it was the kernel of what the Wyeth Foundation is still doing today, supporting conservation, exhibitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was all stymied by this new tax law, but we have made little gifts. Now, who were to be trustees of the Wyeth endowment? Annie and Betsy thought, well, they knew John Coolidge and Phil Hoover at Harvard, so Harvard will have one choice for a trustee. They also were great friends and knew Lloyd Goodrich, the senior American Museum historian, who would also make an appointment. The Wyeth family would make yet an appointment, and there might have been provision for yet another. It was a small board. I was appointed by John Coolidge, representing the Harvard thing. Lloyd Goodrich, of course, was almost self-appointed, representing the Whitney, and obviously Andy and or Betsy appointed themselves. And I forgot. Then there was somewhere along the line a lawyer who worked in Washington, and I don't know how he became friends of the family. That's somebody else's story. A guy named Fred Holborn. This ties a couple of threads together. Fred Holborn was instrumental in helping to create or stimulate the President Nixon, to do an exhibition, turned out to be the first exhibition of an American artist in the White House. And this would now be, well, whatever Nixon's dates are, late 60s. Holborn arranged for a reception. The White House got all cranked up. They put up easels around the East Room. And I think Annie and Betsy must have lent at least a couple of dozen pretty significant works. I can't tell you what was in it. There'd be a record. I was a little old, assistant professor, just starting at Dartmouth College. Of course, when I told my students I'd been invited down to the White House, I was booed out of the room because, of course, this was the beginning of, or not the beginning, but the high moment of horror with the Vietnam War and all of its fallout. But it was an excuse to go. I mean, how could you not turn down? How could you turn down a presidential invitation?
Sure.
And it was, I knew most of the players, but get this, I go down to Washington. I stayed with an aunt. I said, can I borrow your car and drive into the White House? I don't think that the presidential security even asked for a registration plate. I just said, I'm going to be driving in. They said, well, come to I think it's the Southwest Gate, which is the entrance to the Ellipse, and we'll check you in. Well, I did. I found my way to the Southwest Gate, showed them my invitation, and they said, you're all set. Well, what do? You just drive around the Ellipse to the front door. Well, so I drive around there I am, this little baby, in awe of where I am. I'm pulling up to the awning, which is to the diplomatic reception room. I'm thinking, where do I park the car? Where do I leave the car? And the guy comes out and you leave it right there. So there I am in an old beat up car, parked at the awning to the White House.
That's great.
And I walk in and have incredible, it was a memorable occasion. And Annie and Betsy, of course, loved it. But it was also, again, a seedling that recapitulated itself. We come back to in later ways later on.
Yeah.
I went out of screen share. There was to be a slide showing a meeting of the Wyeth Foundation that walked off on us for some reason,
Yeah.
but you get a sense here of the doors that Andrew and Betsy Wyeth have opened, the unexpected chapters. I'm getting to know all these interesting people, and this foundation has now grown to be a really important part of this field of art history of the United States, and has partnered with the Brandywine and also with our valued colleagues up in Maine at the Farnsworth, and created my position. And so one of the many stories here is John's presence there at the very beginning of the former Wyeth Endowment, now the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. So let's jump back into other of these stories I want to be sure to get to while we have time. On to the next. So we've talked about some museums with which you were associated. I wanted to be sure to allow time to talk about this episode. So we talked about long service to Princeton. We've talked about Dartmouth. And then there's this long chapter I've quickly evoked with 3 titles: curator, director, deputy director, sorry, and chairman of the National Gallery in Washington, which for a Wyeth conversation must inevitably touch on the 1987 exhibition, the Helga Pictures. So of which John, it should be clear, was lead curator. So I would love to open the floor and hear about your experience with that really challenging and important episode in the reception history of Andrew Wyeth. What was that like for you?
First, just a quick comment. I must say I'm very proud of the fact that I think I'm the only person who served the gallery in those 3 different capacities, as staff and as
not a common leap.
Ending up as chairman of the board. Anyway, it was in, what was the date?
87.
87. I had gone to Washington in 78, a year. So, and I would be leaving, actually, as it turned out. The Princeton offer came the next year. But by this point, Carter Brown had elevated me to the position of deputy director. So the American department was now on its own. We'd hired a new curator there. But I'll remember that, I never forget Carter, who also knew the Wyeths and knew of my connection to them, when he got a phone call from Leonard Andrews in Brandywine that he had this portfolio of work, and he thought it might be something appropriate for an exhibition. And he came down. Well, anyway, he came down with 1 cylinder box, all he could carry, filled with, I don't know, a dozen drawings, some smaller dry brush watercolors. I don't think there was a temper in the group, but he had photographs of everything else. Anyway, he said, it's a collection of 450 works that Wyeth has painted in private, and has caused this great scandal because it came out into the open and Betsy didn't know about it. And would we like to take it on? Well, the gallery had to go through some manipulations because it had a policy of not doing exhibitions of living artists in their entirety. But Carter contrived a way of doing exhibitions of pieces of artists' career. So we did the Rauschenberg Rocky Overseas Tour group. We did other aspects of major contemporary artists, and it was a silly kind of provision. But likewise, he felt he knew we couldn't do a survey of Andrew Wyeth, but this Carter leapt on for obvious reasons. I mean, he was a hound for publicity, and he knew this would be blockbuster. He just knew it. And he calls me in, and we sit down in the trustees' room and open the solid and go. And I could see right away that it was having known Wyeth's work by that point, it was a very important group of pictures. Uneven, far too big. I said at the outset, we can't possibly show it, don't want to show it all. And I think even what we did show was close to 200 works, probably was too much, although the public loved it. I think it was too much, but it was, Andrew was pushing it. It pushed all kinds of boundaries in the sense that the gallery had provisions that shouldn't take private collections without there being a major gift.
Right.
And indeed, Andrews, to his credit, did give the National Gallery a very important watercolor of the seated black man on the log of wood. I've forgotten what it's called. Beautiful thing. and that he not sell the collection. There were a number of things we said to him, and that it shouldn't be on view excessively. In the end, he disobeyed that agreement and sent it around to 7 museums and ended up in Japan. Almost destroyed the graphic art part of it. Anyway, any case, it was clear that the and it hit the fan. The Time and Newsweek and at least 1/3 magazine all had Helga on the cover. People have asked me, was this a sexual liaison in private? I just would say at the outset, as far as I don't know what went on. To me, it is a series of paintings that I won't say has no sensuosity, but it's not a sexual group of works. It's not erotic. It's not even remotely pornographic, even though there's nudity all throughout it. It's a very moving study of a singular woman seen in a variety of poses, nude, clothed, and unclothed, in a variety of settings. And to me, it was a classic case of the artist painting the nude model in his studio. Simple as that. Betsy, I believe, was pissed because she didn't know he was doing it, not because there was any affair going on. No, that's just me speaking. In any case, we windowed it down to, as I say, about 200 works. Annie and Bessie came to Washington, had a wonderful time. I remember them touring through the preview with George Shultz, Secretary of State. I mean, they were in their element of power, and it was a really. I mean, and Carter was milking it for all it's worth. I thought, of course, and Carter said, "Do you want to write it?" I decided I would tackle writing the catalog because I thought that, as I say, it belonged in this great modern Western tradition of an artist painting the model in the studio, from Giorgione and Titian up to Picasso and Matisse. As simple but as grand as that. And that it would be worth writing an essay with that context, that history in mind. And I'm mentioning that because Abrams' publisher published it in several different languages, German, I think, Japanese, French. I can't remember if it was Italian or not, doesn't matter. And of course, the ultimate irony is I wasn't paid a cent, and the National Gallery was paid no royalty because I was a government servant, civil servant. I couldn't accept anything. I did it on government time. It turned out to be, at the time, the most successful art book ever published.
Oh, wow.
And the first one to go on the New York Times bestseller list. I think the only previous book that had come close was John Rewall's Catalogue Raisonné of Cézanne. So for a brief moment, 1 week, I think I was on the bestseller list. Neither the gallery, and so it was published all over the world. Abrams must have made a fortune, and the gallery, I mean, didn't need the money, but it is one of the nice twists that this great event, brouhaha, all takes place, and that was one part of it. In any case, it was beautifully installed. It was a big public success. Carter got massive publicity.
Got what he wanted, yeah.
Both positive and negative.
Yeah.
I was worried that it was going to be the end of my career, because Wyeth was not in full favor. I mean, he was thought to be, if not an important American artist, questionable. And so when I go down with the ship, in any case, I did not. So that's how I got in on it and wrote what I did. And I'm still pleased with given the circumstances and the twistings and turnings, it was great fun. It was a great Washington event. It was a great Wyeth occasion.
It's wonderful to hear the stories from that episode. My observations from the early days in this new role are that we're still reckoning with that chapter. And you were there right at the beginning. Your book is still definitive, and we are still trying simply to take the work seriously as a tremendous creative achievement. And there is so much baggage and so much difficulty in seeing the work clearly, but we're going to keep on trying to get it right and approach it with nuance and rigor. And it's really inspiring to hear that story from the beginning. Now we're getting toward the end of our time, and I do want to save time for questions. I wanted to get back to that other Wyeth in DC story that you alluded to. We had talked about the Committee for the Preservation of the White House and how Wyeth enters the White House collection. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
We're looking at it is called Jupiter.
Yes.
A marvelous tempera done on Benner Island, Betsy and Andy's last home on the Maine coast. And one day, I don't know whether Andy simply arrived at it, but he knew George Bush, and he got it to the White House and offered it to President Bush. Would you like this for the White House collection? And the president said, well, of course. And it's a magnificent work, and was immediately hung in the family quarters on the second floor.
Hope everyone can see it there in the corner of the picture there.
And it's hung there under what the adjacent work, whether that's a Homer or a Whistler. It did hang near a Whistler and held its own really beautifully. The problem was the White House, like the National Gallery at the time, had a provision that it could not acquire for the permanent collection works of art by living artists until they were dead 25 years. Well, that was blown out of the water by Picasso and Matisse. And we realized we had a quandary here. First of all, the president has accepted his picture. Laura Bush knew right away that it should go to the committee for approval. And what we did was we accepted it, but rather than give it an official registration at that time, we would do so on Wyeth's death, but it certainly needed to remain at the White House. So again, they came to Washington. I'm sorry, there's a wonderful photograph I just saw recently of Laura Bush flanked by Betsy and Andy in front of Jupiter at the moment of presentation. It's a very warm occasion, and I think everybody was pleased. So it in a curious way, been another lifelong career association. I've served on the White House Preservation Committee now from every administration from George Bush's to the present. So this was, again, sort of the Wyeth high moments.
There you go. The doors that Wyeth opens, unexpected passages here. So before we conclude it, I know that many art lovers on the line here will be interested to hear about your role in the formation of this Great American Art Museum. You foreshadowed that in your opening remarks. You were there at the beginning with Shelburne, and then you played a really important role in the creation of Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, where again, we can draw a Wyeth connection with Airborne there on the right, with Alice Walton, the founder, top left. Can you tell us about your role in the creation of that institution?
Came totally out of the blue, again, unexpected. I got a phone call, a letter one summer, this is back in the 90s somewhere, indicating that she was going to start a museum and would I be available on hire, on stipend, to help build the collection. And I won't go into the details, but initially I thought it was a ruse and a mistake, but I accepted, of course. Met Alice Walton, who is the most marvelous personality, very self-effacing. But I realized in working with her, and we set to work right away, she would come up to New York for a couple of days of buying. I hate to think the amounts we committed and spent on a weekend visit. In any case, we started actively buying back in the late 90s. The museum was originally to open in, I think, 06 or 07 on her 60th birthday. It was not ready. It didn't open until 11/11/11. But in that period from the late 90s up to opening day, we were actively buying, and I wasn't the only advisor, probably the principal advisor for the 19th century collection and some of the modern collection. But what it made me realize, you've alluded to it, is that my career has sort of closed with this wonderful full circle of working with a very strong-willed, visionary powerhouse of a collector and museum founder who is really revolutionizing the field, not just the creation of crystal bridges, but Art Bridges, the lending agency that's going to make art available to all kinds of museums in this country. I finally retired from that board last year, so I'm still associated but not active.
So many fascinating stories. I have put more slides in here, but I think we're getting close to the end of our time. So maybe I should just stop sharing my screen. I could ask some general questions to kick things off. If there are any questions from our attendees, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A function here. Other things I had thought of touching on include this man's incredible history as a collector. That might have to be a story for another day. And we've alluded to everything from 19th century American incredible gifts to the National Gallery to pop, as you see behind us here. One could also have gone deeper in connections between the Shelburne effort and Betsy James Wyeth's own effort on those islands in the Gulf of Maine that intrigue me. Another story for another day. One question I want to be sure to leave time for is a very broad one, which is from this unique perspective, this long journey with the Wyeth creative legacy, how do you see the state of Wyeth reception, Wyeth studies today? What are your hopes for the future?
Well, it's been rapidly changing in Andy's last years, and particularly since, and this is one reason you've been hired. We could go into the purposes of the foundation, but for whatever reasons, both Andy and Bessie wanted to keep everything intact, and they wanted to maintain ownership. So the foundation still owns all of Wyeth's oeuvre. It has been placed on long-term loan, indefinite loan, respectively, at the Brandywine, the Pennsylvania work, and at the Farnsworth, the Maine work. And I think everybody on the foundation, everybody associated with the family, realizes that Wyeth is a major, probably one of the great 20th century realists. We could have a wonderful debate on Wyeth versus Hopper, for example. But it's very clear that the homework to be done on placing Wyeth in an international context, in terms of surrealism, in terms of modern European developments, that he has a much bigger place to occupy. And so I think the ground is shifting very quickly. I can't speak. The market's likely to remain fairly steady. The major temperatures are still going to bring glorious prices. They are. But, so I don't think there are going to be a lot of ups. Andy feared that his work would go into not oblivion, but up and down in terms of valuation. That remains to be seen. I don't want to get into those predictions. I think it's absolutely solid what he accomplished. The great works will stand their own unquestionably. And I only see widening horizons for broadening his reputation, his importance, his significance, of getting beyond the cute narratives, all the sort of family histories and so forth. It's the art that counts. And as I said before, the more we come back to it, the more we look at it seriously, the more will be there to tell us.
Well said. I see one lovely question that I'd love to ask. I'd love to know the answer to it myself, which is, what are you thinking about these days? Are you writing? Are you thinking about anything new? Your next topic? Yeah. I come into this man's lair and I see the books open and in progress. So yeah, this is a whirling mind with many other interests. So tell us.
I'll quickly say, I've just finished a book on the imagery of hands in American painting. That's out now, being looked at by publishers. I can't stop writing, unfortunately, good or bad. And at the moment, I'm in the middle of another book, very similar. And this is a book about the imagery of the book in American art,
Love that.
from colonial Bibles and law ledgers all the way up through Peto and Harnett, to Hopper's Lonely Figures, reading books in private. So it's a great topic, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. I don't know that it's a serious blockbuster, but I'm entitled to write at any level of frivolity that I want.
Absolutely. You've certainly earned the right to follow your curiosity wherever it leads, and we are all the beneficiaries of that. Maybe I'll make this one the last, with apologies that I can't get to all. Hello, Ellen. Thank you for joining us. My colleague Ellen Wallach asks, what do you think motivates collectors like Electra Havemeyer-Webb and Alice Walton? What drives these great institution builders?
Great question. Because as a collector myself, some of it is beyond your control. Now, in Electra's case, remember, she was the daughter of the two most powerful American collectors of Impressionism in that generation, now the Metz collection. And so she grew up with collecting. And there's the famous anecdote when she came home one day at the age of 9 with a cigar store Indian on her window arm and an American quilt under the other, and told her parents that she wasn't interested in Rembrandt, Degas, Monet, etc. And her mother looked at her, Louisine, and said, Electra, how can you, brought up with Rembrandts and Degas, want to collect this American trash? Well, so collecting in part, I think, is something beyond your control. It's an instinct, it's part of your DNA. I realize it's part of my DNA. Came on me slowly to realize it. Other collectors like Alice Walton had philanthropic reasons. She realized she grew up in an area of the country that had no museums. I mean, I think there's a museum of drawings in Little Rock, but her region of the American Southeast and Central South has no museums of any major, Kansas City, Oklahoma, some distance. And so she was brought up by her father to be philanthropic. And I think once she got the bug, she herself started teaching herself to paint and then to read about artists. When she put it together, she thought, I want to start collecting what I know and love, and I want it to go to my region of the country and to make a real difference for my country. And that's something that goes back to Sam Walton. And so you see that in her. It's a slightly different motivation, but it also, Alice Walton is one of those great collectors who has not only the resources, the business sense, but has an eye. And not all collectors have those pieces that go together. Many great collectors have the resources, but rely on a Devine or a Berenson or X, Y, or Z.
Or a Wilmerding, indeed.
to build a collection. So some of it comes out of the blue. And but whatever it is, there's some kind of passion there that you're born with, or that somehow, like a virus, takes hold and never lets you go.
And all these institutions you've heard about today, if they are unfamiliar to you, they're well worth a visit. You will see Wyeth in all these places. So the Shelburne Museum outside Burlington, incredible place on the shores of Lake Champlain, the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Northwest Arkansas, and Professor John Wilmerding has had unique insight into all of the above. Thank you so much for joining us for this program of the Wyeth Study Center of the Brandywine Museum of Art.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Please stay tuned for future programs of the Brandywine. As I mentioned, upcoming talks from Victoria Wyeth, our current show through July, Andrew Wyeth Home Places, and I should also foreshadow our next show in collaboration with colleagues at the Farnsworth Art Museum, Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth in Rockland, Maine, opening May 27th. So good things to sort. Thank you very much.